Let's start with Russia, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has called on Ukrainian troops fighting in the Kursk region to surrender. This shortly after US President Donald Trump urged him to spare the lives of the Ukrainian troops. Trump says his envoy held productive talks with Putin on the proposed 30-day ceasefire, even as Russia's counteroffensive intensifies in Kursk. Russia claims to have retaken Sudzha, the biggest town in the Kursk region. These are the images of Sudzha in ruins. This marks a significant shift in the ongoing 3-year-old war. The key town in Kursk was captured by Ukraine in August last year. Ukraine's top military commander, General Alexander Syrsky, says Russian aircraft conducted so many strikes on Kursk that Sudzha has been almost completely destroyed. Russia claims it has intensified evacuation of civilians from Sudzha. In a video released by Russia, evacuees can be seen in a temporary accommodation point where they receive psychological support. Further, Russia has announced that its forces have regained control of 28 settlements in western Kursk over the past week, while Ukraine has reported repelling 22 Russian attacks in that region. As the fierce fighting rages on in the Kursk region, President Putin has called on Ukrainian troops fighting in Kursk to surrender. This was in response to Trump's call. He went on to say that the Ukrainian troops will be guaranteed life if they lay down their arms.
In order to effectively implement the call of the President of the United States of America, we need a corresponding order from the military and political leadership of Ukraine to its military units to lay down their arms and surrender.
This comes after Trump wrote on his social media platform Truth Social that he has strongly requested Putin that lives of Ukrainian soldiers be spared. A direct conversation between the two leaders is yet to take place, but Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff met with the Russian president in Moscow on Thursday. Trump said in his post that they had a very good and productive discussion. Later, at Joint Base Andrews outside Washington, Trump said, and I quote, "Some pretty good vibes are coming from Russia in talks to reach a ceasefire."
From the standpoint about a ceasefire and ultimately a deal, some pretty good vibes coming out of Russia.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has reiterated the need for concessions, calling on both Ukraine and Russia to make compromises. After the G7 talks in Canada, Rubio said that the only way to end the war is through negotiations, which involves both sides making concessions.
That there has to be some level of concessions. What those concessions are remains to be seen. That'll have to be part of the negotiation. But it's not going to be helpful to enter into those negotiations making blanket statements that may give an excuse for one side or the other not to participate in it.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that diplomacy efforts are moving towards end of war, closer to peace. He says Ukraine has accepted the American proposal of unconditional silence in the sky, at sea, and on the front. Zelensky further said that he had discussed the state of diplomacy with French President Emmanuel Macron, reaffirming that Ukraine has clear support from France. European nations are convening in Kyiv's support amid growing worries over Washington causing up to Moscow. A social media post, Macron also said he had discussed the ceasefire proposal with Zelensky and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Macron has called on Moscow to stop its acts of violence, accept the ceasefire proposal made by Washington and Kyiv, and stop making statements aimed at delaying the process. Starmer has also accused Putin of not taking ceasefire attempts seriously, stressing that he cannot be allowed to play games with Trump's deal. Dr. Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR. He's now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Dr. Kupchan, welcome to Wild DNA, and it's good to see you. Let's try and dissect these two statements, or developments, if you like. President Trump urges President Putin to spare Ukrainian troops on the front lines, all of them, and in turn, the Russian leader is telling the troops fighting in Kursk to surrender so that they can be spared. Your reaction?
Well, we don't know exactly what's going on the ground in Kursk, but it looks like the Russians are advancing, are surrounding Ukrainian troops that are still in that southern region of Russia. and probably have the combat capability to push the Ukrainians out. And I think one sign of whether we're going to see Putin show more flexibility, be ready to make some concessions, is whether he lets those troops return to Ukraine or whether he captures them and holds them as prisoners or hostages for the negotiations. Right now, Putin has indicated he's ready to talk, but he's also putting out conditions on those troops and on other issues, which make it clear that it may be quite some time before we get a ceasefire, if in fact we actually get there.
Dr. Kupchan, now that you've mentioned it, I wanted to talk about it, but now you've mentioned it, concessions. The world is still waiting with bated breath, the much anticipated Trump-Putin talk, but even that could happen, or even before that could happen, America, through its Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has reiterated the need for concessions, calling on both Ukraine and Russia to make compromises. Your thoughts?
Well, we don't actually know the details of what's being discussed. And I think it's a bit concerning that in his statements this week, Mr. Putin, although he said he was open to the agreement, also talked about caps on the mobilization of Ukrainian troops, no more Western weapons flowing to Ukraine. Those are demands that the Ukrainians simply cannot comply with because it would leave Ukraine exposed. It would allow Russia to regenerate while Ukraine simply has to sit on its hands. And so I think one concession from Putin will have to be to allow Ukraine to build the capability to defend itself so that Russia doesn't try this again. And perhaps in return, the Ukrainians could say, we will agree not to use force, not to use violence to try to retake those parts of Ukraine that are currently under Russian occupation.
We'll have to wait and see what happens, and we'll also have to wait and see if this ceasefire or truce talks will indeed happen. I've been talking to Dr. Charles Kupchan. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Kupchan, good to see you. Thank you for talking to us today.
Good to see you. Good night.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.